The Thief of Joy by Zzarchov Kowolski. Part 1. For 3,000 years, the air in the tunnel had remained unmoving, in total darkness. Tonight, a night like untold others, the stir of motion returned. A trickle of dust fell from the ceiling. A few moments later, a grinding sound showered a second, much larger cloud of dust into the chamber, as a stone slab was moved. A lone speck of light that left its home star in eons past became the first to enter the tomb since its sealing. Shortly thereafter, the shadow of a cloaked figure blotted out the stars and peered below. With a resounding thud, a sack of grain was dropped from above onto the hard flagstones below. Immediately after impact, a bed of spikes shot up from between the stones and into the sack of grain before slowly sinking back into the ground, their ancient purpose rendered futile. Next came the rope, the excess of its knotted bulk coiling on the ground beside the grain sack. It swayed and creaked slightly as an ash-caked figure descended, leaving smudges as she went. She removed her gloves and leather boots, placing them in a soot-coated satchel she wore across her stomach. Next, she pulled a small earthen flask, reinforced with steel bands, from her bandolier and unscrewed the top, exposing a bed of red coals upon fine sand. She pulled a twig from her sleeve and lit it upon the coals before holding it up to her eyes to study the flame. Slowly the tiny flame flickered, moving in the barely perceptible breeze. She drew a candle and lit it upon the twig before heading down the tunnel, carefully examining the ground before each step, her bare feet as silent as a cat's paws. A few moments later, she spied the outline of a junction in the furthest reaches of the dim candlelight. She paused and studied the henna on the back of her left hand, a stylized partial map of this ancient complex, from the scattered remnants of the plans of its original builders. She swept up a fine line of dust with her hand, and blew it gently into the junction ahead of her. It slowly floated down, and she stared intently, straining her eyes to see any hint of the unusual in how it settled. She was fairly certain she saw a single speck remain suspended in the air, no doubt clinging to some ancient filament tied to some hideous trap. With only a single mote, she could not be certain which way the tripwire ran. She knew it wasn't running past where she stood now, where she would have tripped it. That left directly opposite of where she stood is safe. She could therefore go further down the tunnel, but based on the henna map fragments, she needed to go down the side passage. She considered adding more dust, or perhaps soot, but the filament was quite fine, and too much weight might set it off. The trick, she decided, was to go over it and scale the walls. She was about to attempt this when she realized that nothing she had seen meant the tripwire had to be set on a flat plane. She couldn't deduce any pattern with but a single point. She looked around the walls for evidence of what it could set off. She looked about for a few minutes before noticing the missing grout on a curiously level line of bricks, at about abdomen height. Nervously, she poked the missing grout with a long, thin dagger she drew from a sheath on the back of her calf. She heard the slight grating noise of metal on metal. She felt ridges of a barbed and jagged sheet of metal. She suspected whomever tripped the wire would be impaled by those blades. She carefully examined the floor to see if there was a secondary trap. She dug between the flagstones and found nothing but sand. She tapped them lightly and heard no hollow. Given the two areas she knew were safe from the tripwire, she knew it could not cover the whole corridor. If she crawled low under the blades, she had as good a shot as any of not tripping the wire, and would also be safe from them even if she did. The only worry was if there was anything on the other side. The blade she had found only went 4/5 of the way to the other wall. Anything on the other wall would probably function the same. If the builders were really paranoid, they might have some sort of dart launchers on the other side, but those would probably not function after so long, not if they had any real power. Just to be sure, she held her satchel as a shield and slid on her back along the wall under the hidden blade. Nothing happened, the ideal outcome. She got back to her feet and slowly inched ahead, and soon saw the outline of a grand door illuminated by her faint candlelight. Approaching it, she began to draw her picks before noticing that it was slightly ajar. Examining it closely, she noted, based on the scuff marks, that it had been unlatched from the inside and shoved open. Ominous, she thought to herself. as she drew a riding crop and used it to gently swing the door open. Part 2. As she peered into the room, she noticed the floor had switched to ceramic tiles. Any change is dangerous. Kneeling down, she poured half of her wineskin on the ground. It wasn't exactly a prize vintage, but it still brought a sigh to her lips. She watched it pool away on the floor, indicating a slope. In the eerie silence of a literal tomb, she then heard the echo of a drip. Somewhere below must be a hollow. She held her candle higher and surveyed the room further. There were 6 sandstone sarcophagi in the room. All but one were open. She prodded each tile ahead of her with the riding crop before putting her weight on it as she moved towards the nearest sarcophagi. Its lid had been slid off, and inside were only the smallest fragments of wood and a few torn scraps of funerary robes. If I am lucky, some monster long ago ate these bodies, and it too has since perished. If I am unlucky, something unnatural stalks these halls even now, she thought to herself before correcting. If I am truly unlucky, then tomb robbers have already been through here, and my prize is long gone. She slowly moved towards the unopened sarcophagi, and smelled the faint odor of her wine. A smirk crossed her lips. Whatever had ransacked the other graves had ignored this one, that smelled of the wine she had poured. The wine that was making its way to a hidden hollow. She crouched down with the candle, and held it under the lip of the sarcophagus lid. The underside sparkled in the candlelight. It was encrusted with broken glass and a dry paste of deadly mold spores. She moved her hood across her face and leaned back before igniting the spores with the candle. There was a brief flash of fire, a puff of smoke, and the faint sound of glass tinkling across the tile. She took a moment to wipe away the glass nearest to her with a cheap cloth sash soaked in grease. It was meant for squeaky hinges, but a good burglar must be able to improvise. She undid a button on her sleeve and pulled out a small brass crowbar from a hidden sheath. With a little effort, she was able to slide the lid halfway off the sarcophagus and could look inside. It was empty. She tapped the bottom of the sarcophagus with her crowbar to confirm it was a false bottom before she forcibly pried it open to reveal a narrow set of stairs. She took out a small wooden ball she had brought for just such a purpose and gently rolled it down the stairs. When nothing happened, she went down the stairs. They only went down maybe 5 feet into a small hollow that currently smelled of cheap wine and acrid dust. Still half in the sarcophagus, she bent down to get a better look. There seemed to be a set of stone bas-reliefs of a plaque covered in an ancient script. She set her candle on the top step and shuffled in. The bas-reliefs were set into a terracotta backboard, a dozen or so with pictograms of various local animals. She translated the plaque as, "I am an animal of great power. When the wind blows, I thrive. When the rain falls, I blink. I loathe summer and winter alike, but autumn is my right." She was a bit taken aback. Who actually builds a riddle lock? She tried to think of what that could be as she studied the pictograms. Dog? No. Horse? No. Butterfly? No. Trying to solve this riddle was giving her a fierce headache, and she thought some extra light might help to spot some missing detail. She reached for the candle and brought it closer, causing it to promptly extinguish. Gas! The riddle was merely a ploy to waste time, one she had succumbed to. Cursing her foolishness, she struck the backboard with her crowbar. Its shattering echoed through the pitch-black tomb. She blindly reached in and scooped everything she could find into her bag and stumbled back out the stairs and out of the sarcophagus onto the tile floor. She breathed deeply of the comparatively fresher air and set about the process to relight her candle. She pulled out an oiled twig and took out her container of coals. No sooner had she lit the twig when she saw the horrid face of a desiccated corpse with a maw of jagged, broken teeth standing before her. She bolted as it lunged. Her shoulder clipped the door as she went past it. It had moved since she first entered the room, and a flickering twig is an ideal light source for running through a darkened tunnel. She felt something nearly clasp her hood as she stumbled down the corridor. She dove into a slide, spilling red coals across the flagstones, and hoped the trap had not been sprung. It hadn't. The fiend broke some hidden thread, and a great jagged blade swung from the wall into its torso with a great spray of dust. Despite being impaled, she saw its hands reach down to grasp her in the dim flicker of a single burning twig. With a single deft motion, long practiced for other areas of her life, she drew her greased sash and bound its wrists together. It swung its arms together hard and set her sprawling painfully into hot embers. She rolled to her feet and threw her cloak upon the thing's face before darting in to gingerly poke its bound wrists with the ember-tipped twig she still carried. The grease ignited quickly, and the fire began to quickly spread to the desiccated flesh. Still it did not stop. It flailed about in an attempt to free itself from its many bindings. She took off around the corner in a run, towards the lone beam of moonlight that illuminated her rope. The sound of her footfalls were quickly drowned out by the sound of bending metal and a cackling, inhuman laughter. The flickering light behind her grew brighter. She knew it had freed itself, and had rounded the corner already. She did not look back. She leaped upon the rope and climbed it as fast as she could, but she knew she would not be fast enough. Part 3. With a sudden surge of speed, the rope was hauled upwards, even as she felt the heat of the burning fiend upon her back. No sooner was she hauled onto the sand than a resounding thud echoed out, as the great stone slab had been dropped back into place. Looking around, she saw 4 men standing about, one of them quite well armed, a crusader from the north by appearances. "Oh, thank you for saving me. I am but a poor beggar who fell into that hole," she exclaimed, coughing in an exaggerated motion and shaking some of the soot from her clothing. The crusader looked confused and asked his companions, "How in the world did an elderly woman covered in soot stumble into the secret tomb we've been questing after for 6 months?" Another man, a foppish sort, with a great feathered cap, spoke up with a low bow. "I give you the fabled golden rose, the greatest thief in the City of Joys." She discreetly moved her hand towards her dagger's hilt. "Do you mean to rob an old lady in her twilight years?" "What? Of course not," said the fop. "I am the one who hired you and sent you the map." "You hired an octogenarian to retrieve the seal of Naramas on our behalf? Is this how the tale of our adventures will live on in song? Why not just pay her to use it to steal the eye of all evils while you're at it? Have her complete our whole quest for us." "That is a good point," said the fop. "Ma'am, what kind of rates would you charge to complete such an undertaking?"